It's Casual Friday, and I'm giving my old Aran sweater a dye job. Not this sweater, a different one. But first, an update on last week's project. So this is what the completed wrap looks like. A couple of people asked me about it. I got a kind of an interesting button from the yarn shop near me and put it on. So I'll be sending this off to my mother-in-law later this weekend. So let's talk about the Aran dye job. I had a couple of challenges because I was a little confused about some of the instructions I was reading that were confusing me. I bought the amount of dye that was recommended based on how heavy my wool sweater was, but then after I received the dye and I was rereading instructions, I saw a chart that seemed to suggest that I might actually need twice as much as I had purchased. Because I was using a very dark color. So that confused me. What it turns out is that there are two ways of doing tub dyeing, and that's what I was doing, is tub dyeing. One way is in a top-loading wash machine where you put as hot water as you can get in there, either by turning your water heater up to a higher temperature or by supplementing the hot water with some boiling water in there. So the water needs to be really hot. But on the stovetop, you can control the temperature more and maintain it at a higher temperature. So you have these two different methods, and then you have various fibers that can be used with the acid dyes. So animal fibers like silk or wool or other sorts of fibers can all be used with these acid dyes. So what became clear was that wool, which can felt, I was not using superwash wool, needs to be done using the stovetop method. And when you use the stovetop method, you don't need the kinds of quantities that you might need if you're doing the wash machine method where the water isn't going to be as hot. So the recommendations were something like 1/3 to 2/3 of an ounce per 1 pound of wool. And my sweater was more than a pound, well over a pound, under 2 pounds, but over a pound. So I bought 1.5 ounces just to be safe. So I knew I'd bought more than enough dye. And I decided to use a full ounce of dye when I was dyeing the sweater. When it actually came time to dye the sweater, it was already wet and I couldn't reweigh it. I didn't remember exactly how heavy it was. So I went assuming that it was somewhere between 1 pound 4 ounces and 1 pound 8 ounces. So I used a full ounce of the dye. So a concern I had was that I was dyeing a completed garment. I wasn't dyeing yarn and I wasn't dyeing fleece prior to being spun, because it can be more challenging to dye a completed garment because in the case of an Aran sweater especially, you've got stitches that are overlapping. So you've got multiple layers of stitches. And in the case of the Trinity stitch, which I had on the side, those are really compressed stitches. So I wanted to make sure that I was really going to saturate the fabric completely in hopes that I would, that all of the stitches throughout the sweater would be evenly dyed. And that was one of the problems I had when I dyed it 10 or 12 years ago, is that I don't think I knew how much dye I needed and I didn't have enough. So the sweater had dyed unevenly previously, and so I think, I'm not an expert on dyeing, but I think what happened was that as the sweater entered the dye bath previously, the places that were easy to dye just took the dye, took whatever dye was available until they couldn't take anymore. And the areas that were much more difficult to saturate with dye just didn't have as much dye available to them. Because I do remember completely exhausting the dye bath when I dyed it previously. So when you have a completed garment, it is more difficult. But even when you're dyeing yarn, it can be more difficult to completely saturate the yarn. I have a hank of hand-painted yarn hanging from the curtain wire up there that when I got it home and I untwisted the hank, I saw that there was an area that hadn't dyed. It was still white. So if the dye can't move freely in between all of the fibers, it isn't going to dye as well. So fleece, unspun wool will be the easiest sort of situation to get dye in through all the fibers. That's where that expression dyed in the wool comes from, because you just get the most saturated color when the fibers are dyed prior to being turned into yarn and prior to being turned into fabric or a knitted garment. So I have some self-striping yarns where I've been able to untwist the plies a little bit, and you can see inside sort of the core of the strand of yarn in between all the plies that the backs of those plies are white. So that was really a concern of mine. The thing that I didn't anticipate, I didn't think about, was the fact that I was dyeing the sweater such a dark color and the pot was the same color. So once the sweater went into the pot, I couldn't tell what was happening. And you'll hear in my voiceover that I was getting a little anxious about it. So these are the oxidized stains in the sweater. These are not going to come out, so I'm not even going to really attempt to do anything more than just clean the sweater itself. And this is the Trinity stitch along either side of the new seam. The Trinity stitch didn't take the original dye as well as the rest of the sweater because it's such a tight stitch pattern. This is the sleeve with some stains, but also some miscrossed cables. Like first one crossed to the right, and then the left, second left, third left, and then another one to the right. I'm not going to fix them. Nobody ever notices. You have to wash your wool before you can dye it. So you wash it in a little bit of detergent, rinse it clean. I gave it several rinses, and then on Thursday morning, I soaked it again in just plain water. You mix the dye. I mixed it outside. I had a dust mask on, and I mixed it in a plastic cup. I had a full ounce of the dye, which is kind of a lot for the amount of water I had. So it didn't get completely mixed. So I poured some of it out, and then I went outside again and put some more boiling water in the cup to mix it up, and then I came back and finished dumping it. Now this is warm tap water that I've got in the pot, and the sweater is soaking in warm tap water as well. So I'm giving it a good stir to make sure all of the dye is mixed very well into this warm water. So now I'm going to move the sweater from one warm water bath to another, and this is into the dye pot. I wasn't sure how far to fill up the dye pot, so it's a little bit lower than what it should be, but I'm going to push everything underneath, and you can see it's already absorbing all of this navy blue dye. I'm going to put a little bit more water in there to give it a higher level, because I want the sweater to be able to move around as much, or let the water in the dye move around as much as possible. And so I'm giving it a little bit of a stir to try to get that new water mixed in with the dye. You have to be really careful not to agitate the wool while you're mixing it so that it won't felt, but you also have to get the dye mixed in. So it's a little bit of a trick, and it's very hard to see because of the dark blue pot. So I'm going to cover it when I'm heating it, just so that it'll heat up faster. It needs to come up to 185 to 200 degrees. So I'm going to check it every 5 minutes. It's just about hot enough. It's about 180 at this point. So it's not quite hot enough, but you can see what's going on here. I'm just pushing this under the surface so that everything can get dyed. You can see how purple the dye is on the spoon. I'm putting that on paper towels, on newspaper, and cardboard. So I can't tell what's happening. I'm afraid it might be felting, but I really don't know what's going on. So now it's at 185, it's time to add the acid. In this case, it's vinegar. For this dye, they want you to add 1/4 cup of vinegar per pound of wool. Since I have about 1 1/4 pounds of wool, I'm adding 1/3 of a cup. vinegar, and you're not supposed to pour it directly on the wool. So I'm pushing the wool aside to pour the vinegar in, and then I got to mix the vinegar in so the acid gets throughout the water. And again, to try to do this without it felting. So once you've got the temperature up to 185 and you've got the vinegar in, then it's got to stay at this temperature for 30 to 60 minutes. For most dyes, 30 minutes is enough, but for some of these darker ones, they say it can take up to 60 minutes for the dye to exhaust. You can see how purple the water is at this point. And they tell you to stir it frequently. I just hope that it's not felting. If it does, I'll make a bag out of it or something. But I really hope it doesn't felt. So I checked after about 15 minutes. You can see it's not anywhere near as purple as it's kind of gray now. It's only 15 minutes, but so I'm going to keep letting it go and check it every 5 to 10 minutes, and also trying to make sure that it isn't hotter on the bottom of the pot, the sweater part at the bottom of the pot isn't hotter than closer to the surface. And again, I'm worried about agitating. So I added a little bit more vinegar to see if that would help. It doesn't really seem like it's exhausted anymore, but I'm going to keep checking and let it go longer. So now it's been an hour and the water's still a little bit dingy, but when I pour it onto the paper towel, it doesn't really show any color. You can see how dark the color was before. So now I'm just going to turn off the heat and I'm going to put it outside and let it cool down on its own. So again, I don't want to shock it with a cold water, and because I don't want it to felt. So I think one of the things that you can hear in my voice in that voiceover, which I was recording while the wool was cooling off, is that I really couldn't tell what had happened with the sweater. I was so afraid that it had felted, because anytime any of the fabric kind of rose to the surface and all of the fibers were loose and relaxed, it kind of looked fuzzy to me, and I was like, is it felted? Is it felted? I could not see that navy blue yarn in that navy blue pot. I didn't know. So it was hours. It took about 5 hours after I took it off the stove and had it on the back porch before it was cool enough for me to dump the water out. So if you're wondering, did I felt the sweater? The answer is I did not. So here's the sweater. You can see the dye completely saturated everything. You can't see stains on the front, and the cuffs are not rusty anymore either. So I'm really, really happy with how it turned out. You can see the Trinity stitch is completely saturated here. So I think one of the things, that dye bath never completely was exhausted. And that was, I realized that, I probably really was pushing the maximum amount of dye that I'd put in the dye bath. And so every part of the sweater had taken as much dye as it could, and there was just a little bit left. And because of that, I knew that when I rinsed it out, there would still be some dye probably on the surface of the sweater. So it took, I rinsed it right away, and then I filled up a sink with a little bit of Dawn dish detergent and let it soak for half an hour to really try to release any excess dye. Filled it up, the sink up again with rinse water, rinsed all the soap out, filled it up a fourth time, and then let it soak for half an hour. So then I took it down to my washing machine. I have an old top loader, and I just spun all the extra water out and let it dry overnight. So I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I consider it a success that I don't have to turn it into mittens. So that's it for this Casual Friday. I hope you enjoyed my my adventures in over-dyeing my sweater. And actually, this turned out to be a nice way to get a really dark color sweater without having to knit with a dark colored yarn. So if anybody ever asks me at some point in time to knit them something in navy blue or black, which I never will do, I might consider doing a dye job on the finished garment. Thanks for watching.